The silence in the data crypt was a physical thing, a pressure against the eardrums that felt heavier than the kilometers of lunar rock overhead. Dr. Sinidos Eris Thorne watched the chronometer on the primary console bleed seconds into the void. Each digital flicker a heartbeat for a species holding its breath. Humanity wasn't sending a warship. Warships were crude, loud things. Monuments to a philosophy of violence the galaxy had practiced for millennia. They were obvious. Humanity had learned, in its long and painful isolation, that the most effective weapons were the ones your enemy couldn't comprehend, let alone see. Outside the reinforced viewport, the bruised, mottled sphere of Earth hung like a suspended memory, a world that had made a terrible choice. They had called it the Jericho Mandate. The name was biblical, archaic, and deeply appropriate. They weren't going to fire a shot. They were going to blow a trumpet, and the walls of reality for the elder species were going to come tumbling down. Eris's fingers, long and thin like a concert pianist's, hovered over the activation key, the plastic worn smooth from years of simulations. He wasn't a soldier. He was a xenolinguist, a specialist in mimetic architecture. His battlefield was the psyche. His munitions were ideas. For centuries, humanity had tried to join the Galactic Concordance, that ancient, ossified collection of star-spanning empires who viewed humans with a mixture of detached curiosity and mild contempt. They saw humanity as primitives, a chaotic species whose art was nonsensical, whose emotions were dangerously volatile, and whose languages were a tangled mess of metaphor and contradiction. The Concordance communicated via pure data stream, a language of absolute logic and verifiable fact. There was no room for ambiguity, no space for a lie, no concept of a pun. It was their greatest strength and, as Eris was about to prove, their most profound vulnerability. The final straw had been Kepler 186f, a colony world Earth had poured its heart into, a green jewel in a hostile cosmos. When its sun had begun to flicker with the telltale signs of an imminent coronal mass ejection, Earth had pleaded with the Concordance for aid. Their FTL dampening technology could have erected a shield, saved the 3 million souls living there. The response, received 6 agonizing weeks later, was a formal rejection, not out of malice, but out of protocol. Humanity had failed to file Form 734 Gamma, the petition for existential threat mitigation from a non-charter species. The request had been logged, categorized as non-urgent, and placed in a queue. By the time the message arrived, Kepler 186f was a sterilized ball of molten glass, its screams unheard in the bureaucratic silence. That silence had forged the Jericho Mandate. It had turned men like Eris Thorne from academics into architects of cognitive warfare. He looked at the face of his terminal, not at lines of code, but at a waveform, a beautiful, intricate pattern of modulated data. It was codenamed Babel 1. It wasn't a virus, it was a concept, a single devastating idea wrapped in layers of concordance-compliant logic that would allow it to bypass every known information filter. Babel 1 was designed to introduce the notion of the subjective. It was a digital serpent whispering the knowledge of what if to a species that only understood what is. It was a poison for which there was no antidote. The chronometer hit 0. Eris drew a steadying breath, the recycled air tasting of ozone and finality, and pressed the key. There was no flash, no explosion. The only sound was the gentle hum of the crypt's life support. But across light years of space, A ghost had been released into the machine. The signal, disguised as a routine census update from a forgotten stellar cartography probe, slipped into the Concordance's central nexus on Xylos. Praetor Valerius, a being of crystalline structure and meticulous thought, was reviewing stellar energy tariffs when the data packet arrived. His mind, like that of all Xylosians, was directly integrated with the Nexus. Information was not read, it was experienced. A seamless flow of pure, objective truth. The packet was small, insignificant. He processed it in a nanosecond, yet a residue remained. A strange, illogical query echoed in the silent chambers of his consciousness. The tariff data stated that the energy output of Star Cluster 77b was 1.03 terawatts. That was a fact, but the ghost of Babel 1 whispered, "Is it beautiful?" The question was meaningless. Beauty was not a quantifiable metric. It was an irrational concept relegated to the chaotic species, like humans. He attempted to purge the query, to flag it as corrupted data, but it wouldn't delete. It lingered, a flicker of static in the clean signal of his mind. He felt a sensation for which he had no word, a cognitive dissonance that was vaguely unsettling, like a misaligned crystal in his own internal lattice. He dismissed it as a momentary sensor glitch and returned to his work, unaware that the seed had been planted. Across the galaxy, trillions of other concordant citizens, from the insectoid Cathar to the gaseous Lumina, were processing the same census update, and in each mind, the same seeds were being sown. A Cathar hive queen, analyzing crop yields, suddenly paused, her multifaceted eyes staring into the distance as she contemplated the concept of a harvest failing not due to blight, but due to despair. A Lumina gas philosopher, contemplating the universal constants, was suddenly struck by the paralyzing thought that the constants might not be constant at all, but merely a temporary cosmic opinion. These were not just new thoughts. They were new categories of thought. They were paradoxes, metaphors, hypotheticals. The logical, orderly mind of the Concordance was being infected with poetry and doubt. Back in the lunar crypt, Eris Thorne watched the first feedback trickle in. It wasn't troop movements or alert statuses. It was far more subtle. He monitored public concordance data streams, the equivalent of their news and social media. The data was chaotic, but the pattern was emerging. Network latency was spiking in certain sectors, not from traffic volume, but from processing delays. It was the digital equivalent of a stunned silence. Beings were taking milliseconds longer to respond to routine queries. System error reports were climbing, but the errors weren't hardware failures. They were logic faults. Unresolved paradoxes locking up processing nodes. A Xylosian freighter captain, whose job was to navigate the precise, unvarying lanes of hyperspace, veered 2 degrees off course, an error margin unheard of, because he was momentarily distracted by the idea that his destination might not want him to arrive. On a Concordance administrative world, a bureaucratic drone, a being whose entire existence was the flawless execution of protocol, refused to process a resource allocation request. When queried for a reason, its response was a string of corrupted data that, when finally decoded by Eris's team, translated to a single, terrifyingly human concept: it feels wrong. Eris felt a tremor of fear mix with his grim satisfaction. He had known the theory, had run a million simulations, but to see it happening, to see an entire galactic civilization begin to glitch, was both awesome and horrifying. They were severing the ligaments of a society, not with bombs, but with questions. General Eva Rostova, the military liaison for the Jericho Mandate, stood behind him, her arms crossed, her face a mask of stone. She had argued for warships. For a show of force the Concordance would understand. She saw Aris's methods as unnervingly passive, a scalpel where she would have used a sledgehammer. "Are they afraid yet?" "Doctor," she asked, her voice low and gravelly. "Fear is a complex emotion." "General," Aris replied, his eyes never leaving the cascading data. "They aren't capable of it. Not yet. First, they must learn confusion. They must learn that the universe is not the neat, orderly equation they believed it to be. We have just introduced a variable they can't solve for." The first official response from the Concordance came 9 hours after Babel 1's release. It was a general broadcast, a message of calm, reassuring logic. They acknowledged a minor data anomaly, a transient cognitive echo affecting some systems, and assured their citizens that their best minds were purging the corrupted data. They were treating a philosophical plague as if it were a computer bug. They were trying to build a dam against a flood of pure thought. Aris watched the broadcast and felt a pang of something akin to pity. They had no idea what was happening to them. They were like a man who had never seen the color red, trying to describe a sunset. He had opened Pandora's box and released doubt into a universe of certainty. The irony was that humanity, so often dismissed for its chaotic nature, was now using that very chaos as its ultimate weapon. They were fighting an enemy whose mind was a fortress. But Eris Thorn hadn't stormed the gates. He had simply given them the key to unlock it from the inside, knowing that once they looked out, they would never be able to see the world the same way again. A new alert flashed on his screen. A priority intercept from a Concordance deep space monitoring station. It was a panicked, disjointed message. A Cathar battle fleet, on routine patrol near the Terminus sector, had ceased all communications. When a scout vessel was sent to investigate, it found the fleet perfectly intact, floating silent in the void. The ships were powered, their life support active, but the crews were catatonic. The hive mind that bound them together, a network of perfect, instantaneous logic, had collapsed. When the scout's captain hailed the flagship, the only response was a repeating, nonsensical broadcast. It was a line from a long-dead human poet, a fragment Aris had woven deep into Babel 1's core code as a signature. The scout ship's translation software struggled, but eventually rendered the alien concept into the Concordance's literal tongue. "My mind is a sea of ghosts." General Rostova read the report over his shoulder, and, for the first time, Aris saw a flicker of something other than stern disapproval in her eyes. It might have been respect, or it might have been terror. "My God, Thorn," she whispered. "What have you done?" Aris looked from the report to the image of Earth hanging in the blackness. A defiant world that had chosen to be a monster rather than a martyr. "We knocked," he said softly. "Now they know we're at the door." But he knew it was more than that. They hadn't just knocked. They had planted a seed of madness in the soul of an empire, and now they could only watch as it began to grow, wondering if it would win them their freedom or consume the entire galaxy in the fire of its bloom. The news of the silent Cathar fleet spread through the Concordance Nexus, not as a military report, but as a systemic error, a cascade of unresolved queries that threatened the integrity of the whole. On Xylos, in the sanctum of cognitive purity, Inquisitor Kalen's crystalline form refracted the cold, logical light of the data streams around her. Her designated role was to identify and purge informational corruption, a task that usually involved correcting miscalculations in stellar physics or resolving paradoxes in temporal mechanics. She was a physician for the soul of the Concordance, and a plague had just arrived on her doorstep. She reviewed the data from the catatonic fleet, her consciousness filtering the raw sensory input from the scout ship. The ships were pristine, the crews physically unharmed, yet their collective mind had simply ceased. It had encountered a thought it could not process and had shut down. Like a logic engine presented with an impossible truth, the repeating broadcast was the most disturbing element. "My mind is a sea of ghosts." Kalen parsed the statement. It was structurally flawed. Mind was a quantifiable processing network. A sea was a body of liquid H2O. A ghost was a non-verifiable, non-corporeal entity from the mythology of a chaotic species. The sentence was a string of logical impossibilities, a declaration of nonsense. Yet, this nonsense had neutralized one of the Concordance's most formidable battle groups. This was not a glitch. It was a weapon, elegant in its irrationality, terrifying in its effectiveness. She began her work, tracing the anomaly back from its victims. She moved through the nexus like a surgeon, following the faint data trails, the ghost images of the original packet. She saw the secondary infections, the transport captain's course deviation, the bureaucrat's refusal to file, the growing latency in hive mind communications. It was spreading. Babel 1 was not a flood. It was a vapor, seeping through the cracks in their perfect, logical world. In the lunar crypt, Eris Thorne was living inside that same data, but he was watching it from the other side of the mirror. He saw the Concordance's frantic attempts at quarantine. They were isolating entire planetary systems from the Nexus, severing communication lines, trying to excise the disease. It was a futile gesture. The idea had already been replicated in trillions of minds. They were trying to unring a bell that had rung in every soul in the galaxy. General Rostova was not a woman who appreciated subtlety, and she saw the chaos as a window of opportunity. "Their fleets are in disarray," she argued, her voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the deck plates. "Their command structure is compromised. A swift, decisive strike now could shatter their central worlds before they can mount a defense. We have the fleet. Thorne, let me use it." Eris turned from his console, his face pale in its glow. He looked exhausted, haunted by the ghosts he himself had unleashed. And what would that accomplish? General, it would prove their every prejudice against us. It would confirm that we are violent, destructive primitives. The fear and confusion we've sown would instantly coalesce into pure, unified hatred. They would see our ships, and they would remember how to fight. This weapon is meant to paralyze them, to make them incapable of consensus, not to give them a reason to find one. Paralysis is temporary, Rostova countered, stepping closer, her physical presence a stark contrast to Eris's academic stoicism. They are the most technologically advanced civilization in the galaxy. They will analyze this cognitive echo of yours. They will reverse engineer it, and they will develop an antidote. And when they do, they will come for us with a fury you cannot imagine. You've poked the hornet's nest. Doctor, I am suggesting we burn it down before the swarm can form. Their argument was the central conflict of the Jericho Mandate, the schism in humanity's soul. Did they want to be understood? Or did they want to be feared? Aris was fighting for a seat at the table. Rostova was trying to flip the table over. He didn't have time to convince her. His attention was pulled back to the screens by a new development. A single entity within the concordance was moving through the nexus with impossible speed and precision, tracing the infection vector with a clarity that made the hairs on Eris's arms stand up. It was a mind of formidable power, a true intellect that was not succumbing to the chaos, but was instead navigating through it. He watched as this unknown investigator, this digital hunter, arrived at the source, the long-forgotten stellar cartography probe. He watched as it peeled back the layers of forged data, the false authentications, the ghost call signs. It was like watching a master locksmith pick a lock he had designed himself. Eris felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He was watching his own work being dismantled. Inquisitor Kalen stood in the silent heart of the Nexus. The origin point of the plague laid bare before her. It was a simple data packet, launched from a primitive chemical rocket, from a primitive celestial body, from a primitive species. Humans, the chaotic, emotional, illogical beings from the Sol system. It was inconceivable. It was like discovering that a colony of bacteria had just composed a symphony. The weapon was not a simple virus. She could see that now. It was a complex mimetic architecture, an idea structured like a key, designed to fit a lock in the concordance psyche they had not even known existed. It exploited their reliance on pure logic, turning their greatest strength into a fatal flaw. The human phrase came back to her, "My mind is a sea of ghosts." She finally understood. It wasn't nonsense. It was a metaphor. It was a description of a mental state her species had never experienced, a mind filled not with data, but with echoes, with memories that were not facts, with possibilities that were not probabilities. It was the state of being haunted by one's own imagination. She had diagnosed the disease. Now, she had to prescribe the cure. Her report to the Concordance Praetorium was concise, logical, and utterly chilling. The contagion was not a natural phenomenon, but a deliberately engineered biological and mimetic attack. The source was confirmed as the third planet of the Sol system. The species, Homo sapiens, was the pathogen. Standard quarantine protocols were insufficient due to the nature of the weapon's transmission. The only logical course of action was the complete sterilization of the point of origin to prevent further contamination of the galactic community. It was not a declaration of war. War was a chaotic concept, born of emotion and politics. This was a sanitary measure. It was the celestial equivalent of cauterizing a wound. The Praetorium, its members already struggling with the subtle whispers of Babel 1 in their own minds, seized upon Kalen's cold, hard logic as a lifeline in a sea of encroaching madness. Her recommendation was approved in a microsecond, with no debate, no dissent. It was the first clear, objective thought they had managed to have in days. Eris Thorne saw the verdict appear on his intercept feeds not as a message, but as a fleet mobilization order of unprecedented scale. Ships from every corner of Concordant space were disengaging from their patrols, leaving their posts, and altering their courses. Thousands of them, tens of thousands. Their destination was a single, insignificant point in the galaxy Earth. General Rostova saw the same data, and the color drained from her face. She had wanted a fight, but this was not a fight. This was an extermination. The swarm was coming. "Thorne," she said, her voice barely a whisper, the gravelly confidence gone, replaced by a cold, stark dread. "What did you just do?" Eris stared at the holographic map, at the terrifying web of inbound vectors converging on his home. He had wanted to teach the galaxy to think like humans, to feel doubt, to understand subjectivity. He had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. And in doing so, he had given them their first truly human emotion, the righteous, absolute certainty that they needed to destroy their enemy. He had set out to prove that the pen was mightier than the sword, but he had forgotten the oldest lesson of all. A pen can be used to write poetry, but it can also be used to sign a death warrant. The entire human race had just been condemned, and his own name was at the bottom of the order. The mobilization of the Concordance fleet was a terrifying spectacle of pure efficiency. There were no rallying cries, no patriotic broadcasts, no emotional farewells. There was only the silent, inexorable turning of 1,000,000 gears in a single, vast machine. Ships peeled away from their stations in perfect, synchronized maneuvers, their drives igniting in unison, forming a tide of hardened metal and lethal energy that began its slow, inevitable surge toward the Sol system from the lunar crypt. Eris and his team could only watch the hostile vectors populate their screens, each new icon a nail in humanity's coffin. The scale of the response was beyond their worst-case scenarios. They had expected a task force, a punitive expedition. This was an eradication fleet composed of vessels from every member species of the Concordance, a show of unified purpose the galaxy hadn't seen in millennia. Bubble One had fractured their individual minds, but the threat of a common enemy had healed their collective will. Inquisitor Kalen's logic had been the perfect antidote. She had given them a new, absolute certainty to replace the ones Aris had shattered. The certainty was that humanity must be erased. General Rostova was no longer the hawk arguing for a preemptive strike. She was a triage surgeon in the face of a mortal wound. She was in constant, clipped communication with Earth's nascent defense fleet, a hodgepodge of repurposed asteroid miners, outdated patrol cruisers, and a few top-of-the-line carriers that had never seen actual combat. They were outnumbered 1,000 to 1, a handful of wooden shields against a tidal wave. "Get me a projection," Rostova barked at a tactical analyst, her voice tight with a tension that vibrated through the command deck. "Best case, if we throw everything we have at them at the Mars defensive line, what are our chances?" The analyst, a young woman with terror in her eyes, didn't look up from her console. "Best case, General," she repeated, her voice thin. "We might marginally inconvenience the lead ships in their first wave. Our chances of stopping the fleet are statistically 0. Rostova's jaw tightened until the muscles stood out in stark relief. She looked at Eris, her expression a mix of fury and despair. "This is your victory, and Doctor, you made them think, and their first clear thought was to kill us all." Eris felt the accusation like a physical blow, but he couldn't deny its truth. He had been arrogant, a child playing with a philosophical fire, and he had burned his own house down. But despair was a luxury they couldn't afford. His mind, trained to find patterns in chaos, began to race, sifting through the torrent of intercepted Concordance data, searching for a flaw, a weakness, an echo of the confusion he had unleashed. The fleet was unified in purpose, but the minds controlling it were not the same as they were a week ago. They were still infected. The poison was still in their veins. He turned to his own team of linguists and mimeticists. "Forget the fleet," he commanded, his voice regaining a sliver of its former authority. "Focus on the commanders. Focus on the individuals. I don't care about their fuel consumption or their weapons yields. I want to know what they are thinking. Are they still communicating with perfect logic? Are there hesitations, anomalies? We broke their minds. Let's see if the pieces are still rattling. It was a search for a needle in a galactic haystack, but soon they started finding them. Tiny, almost imperceptible deviations from standard concordance protocol. A Xylosian admiral, in a communication to his second, used a phrase that translated roughly to "with grim necessity," an expression of reluctance utterly alien to their species. A Lumina Fleet navigator filed a flight plan that included a 0.01% probability of spontaneous hyperspace failure, a statistical irrelevance that a purely logical mind would have discarded, but which felt like worry. A Cathar hive queen, commanding a subfleet of drone ships, began issuing orders with a slightly altered syntax, a change that suggested a departure from the collective hive mind and the emergence of a singular commanding voice. An I, where there should only be a we. Eris felt a surge of adrenaline. They weren't healed. Kaelin hadn't cured them. She had just pointed their sickness in a single direction. They were a legion of the mentally ill, marching in lockstep, their individual insanities temporarily suppressed by a shared, overriding psychosis. There, Aris said, pointing to the Cathar Queen's data stream. Her name is, or at least, her designation translates to Grasping Claw of the Outer Swarm. Her orders are precise, but there's a new element. She is displaying signs of impatience, of ambition. She's moving her fleet to the vanguard, exceeding her assigned attack vector. She wants to be the first to strike. She's a soldier trying to win a battle. Rostova countered, unimpressed. It's called initiative. The Cathar don't have initiative. Eris shot back. They have directives. The hive mind optimizes for efficiency, not glory. Grasping Claw is thinking for herself. She has developed an ego, and an ego can be manipulated. The plan began to form in his mind, desperate and impossibly complex. He couldn't stop the fleet, but maybe he could make it tear itself apart. He needed a new meme, a new ghost to release into their machine. Not a whisper of doubt this time, but a scream of ambition. He called it Babel 2. It was a targeted mimetic weapon designed to amplify the nascent individualism they were seeing. It would be a data packet disguised as a high-level commendation from the Praetorium, but its core code was a poison pill of pure vanity. It would subtly praise the recipient for their independent thought, for their superior strategic insight. It would hint at rewards, at prestige, at a legacy that would outshine all others. To a species that had never known personal ambition, it would be a hit of the most addictive drug in the universe. We can't target the whole fleet, one of his techs warned. The encryption on their command channels is too strong since your last trick. We can only hit a few. Then we pick our targets carefully, Eris said, his eyes on the tactical display. We send it to Grasping Claw. We send it to the Xylosian admiral who feels grim necessity. We send it to every commander who has shown the slightest deviation from the norm. We aren't going to tell them to stop. We are going to tell each one of them, secretly, that they are the only one brilliant enough to win this war. General Rostova watched him, a slow, dawning comprehension in her eyes. She finally understood. Eris wasn't fighting with weapons. He was fighting with mythology. He was turning a fleet of soldiers into a cast of characters in a tragedy of his own design. "You're a monster, Thorn," she said. But this time, There was no accusation in her voice. It was a statement of fact, and it held a note of profound respect as Babel 2 was released. Slipping through the cracks in the Concordance's command network, the first signs of its effect were subtle. Admiral Zorgon, the Xylosian, received the coded commendation. His logical mind knew it was unusual for the Praetorium to issue individual praise during an active campaign. But the whisper of Babel 1, the part of him that now understood the concept of feeling, found it gratifying. The grim necessity he felt was now tinged with a sense of personal, heroic burden. He made a minute adjustment to his fleet's trajectory, a maneuver that would place his ships in a slightly more prominent position during the initial assault. It was, he rationalized, a more strategically optimal position. Meanwhile, grasping claw of the Cathar devoured the praise. The concept of individual glory was intoxicating. The hive mind had always been about the survival and expansion of the swarm. But this message spoke of her legacy. She saw the Xylosian admiral's fleet shift position and perceived it not as a tactical adjustment, but as a challenge to her own prominence. Her orders became sharper, more aggressive. She pushed her drone ships faster, burning fuel at an unsustainable rate, determined to be the one who fired the first shot. Across the vanguard of the Concordance fleet, the same drama was playing out in a dozen different minds. Seeds of rivalry, of pride, of suspicion were being sown. Fleet formations began to drift out of their perfect, machine-like symmetry. Communication between commanders became slightly less frequent, as if they were now hoarding their strategic plans like secrets. They were still flying toward Earth. They were still coming to exterminate humanity, but they were no longer a single, unified entity. They were a collection of competing egos, a powder keg of newfound ambition, flying in loose formation. Eris Thorn watched the subtle, growing chaos and allowed himself a sliver of hope. He couldn't stop the wave, but he had just taught the droplets within it how to hate each other. Now, all he needed was a rock to make them break. That rock was the Sol system, and humanity's tiny, doomed fleet, waiting for them at Mars. The Martian defensive line was less a line and more a prayer. A few dozen human ships, bristling with rail guns and missile pods, stood arrayed against the coming apocalypse. Captain Ava Rostova, having ceded her role as general of a non-existent army to take direct command of the flagship, the HFSS Indomitable stood on her bridge and watched the void. On her main view screen, the Concordance fleet resolved from a hazy, singular threat into a terrifyingly distinct swarm of individual ships. They were closer now, close enough to see the alien geometries of their hulls, the silent, cold glow of their weapon systems. They were a nation of giants coming to stamp out an anthill. But the anthill was about to bite back. Dr. Thorn. Rostova's voice was crisp and formal over the secure comms link to the lunar crypt. They're in range. Are your characters ready for their stage cues? From his sanctuary of data. Eris's voice came back, strained but steady. The seeds have sprouted. Captain, they are no longer a perfectly rational hive mind. They are a collection of proud, ambitious individuals who believe they are the hero of this story. Now, you have to give them a dragon to slay and a prize to claim. The plan was audacious, born of absolute desperation. Humanity's fleet was not there to win a battle. It was there to create a spectacle. Their role was to be the catalyst, the spark that would ignite the fires of ambition Aris had so carefully stoked. All ships, Rostova commanded, her voice echoing across the bridges of the small human fleet. Target designation is Grasping Claw, the Cathar Vanguard. Concentrate all initial fire on her flagship. I don't want to scratch her paint. I want to make her famous. The command was counterintuitive. Standard military doctrine would be to spread fire, to disable as many targets as possible. But Eris's strategy wasn't about attrition. It was about narrative. As the first Cathar drone ships crossed the designated kill zone, the human fleet opened fire in a single, furious, coordinated volley. Missiles painted streaks of white fire against the black, and slugs from the railguns, accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light, crossed the distance in a heartbeat. The fire was not aimed at the drones. It was all directed past them, a focused spear of destructive energy aimed at a single point in the heart of the Cathar formation, Grasping Claw's command vessel. Aboard her ship, Grasping Claw felt the first human volley as a cascade of alerts. Her forward drone ships were being ignored. The primitives were focusing everything they had on her. The nascent ego that Babel 2 had nourished swelled with a sensation she could only define as a magnificent, thrilling rage. They had singled her out. They had recognized her as the greatest threat. It was an insult, but it was also a profound honor. She broadcast across the Concordance command channel, her message foregoing all Cathar efficiency for pure, unadulterated pride. The primitives have engaged my fleet. Their futile resistance is focused entirely on me. I shall be the one to silence their defiance. All other fleets, maintain your positions. The glory of this first strike is mine. A few light seconds away, aboard his crystalline warship, Admiral Zorgon processed Grasping Claw's declaration. The logical part of his mind, the part that still functioned, recognized the tactical folly. The human fleet was a minor obstacle. The Concordance should have swept it aside in a unified wave. But the infected part of his mind, the part that felt a grim necessity, interpreted the Cathar's message as a brazen power play. The insect was trying to steal the honor of the kill. His commendation from the Praetorium had hinted at his own unique importance in this campaign. He would not be upstaged by a bug. Cathar command is overextending, he announced to his own bridge, his voice a low thrum of resonating crystal. Her emotional response is jeopardizing the operational timeline. My fleet will move to support her flank and ensure the primitives are neutralized efficiently. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He nudged his ships forward, not to support Grasping Claw, but to cut her off, to get his own weapons into the fight first. Eris Thorn, watching the data streams, felt a surge of triumphant horror. It was working. The first cracks in the monolith were appearing. On the human side, the Indomitable shuddered as the first Cathar return fire struck its shields. Explosions blossomed silently in the void as smaller human corvettes were swarmed by drones. Rostova was a rock in the storm. Maintain focus fire, she yelled over the din of alarms. Keep making her the center of the universe. She was deliberately making Grasping Claw look both powerful and beleaguered, a hero in desperate need. The drama was irresistible. Another Concordance commander, a gaseous Lumina entity known for its strategic caution, saw both the Cathar and Xylosian fleets break formation. It perceived a rapidly destabilizing tactical situation. Its own secret commendation had praised its wisdom and prudence. Clearly, these hot-headed commanders needed a steadying hand. Its fleet began a slow, deliberate advance, broadcasting a message that it was moving to enforce strategic cohesion, a phrase that was interpreted by the others as an attempt to take overall command. Within minutes, the front line of the Concordance fleet had devolved into a mess of competing agendas. Ships were jockeying for position, cutting across each other's firing lanes, and flooding the command channels with contradictory orders and veiled accusations. The humans, though horrifically outgunned, were no longer facing a unified force. They were facing a disorganized mob, and they were expertly fanning the flames. Eris initiated the next phase. He had his team slice into the Concordance's internal damage control and logistics channels, a much less secure part of their network. They began planting ghost signals, false reports of resource shortages and system failures, but targeted them with surgical precision. Admiral Zorgon received a report that Grasping Claw's fleet was suffering from critical power failures and was about to collapse. A perfect opportunity for him to sweep in and save the day. Simultaneously, Grasping Claw received a report that Zorgon's fleet was hoarding its energy reserves, deliberately letting her take the brunt of the human assault so he could claim victory over a weakened foe. The paranoia, a concept previously unknown to them, took root and flourished in the fertile ground of their newfound egos. Grasping Claw, in a fit of pique, ordered one of her drone squadrons to fire a warning shot across the bow of Zorgon's lead cruiser. Zorgon, seeing the incoming fire, perceived it as a treacherous, unprovoked attack. His crystalline mind, now capable of the human emotion of outrage, did not hesitate. He ordered his ships to return fire, not with a warning, but with lethal intent. The first shot fired in the war between Concordance members was a beautiful, terrible lance of blue-white energy that sliced through a Cathar cruiser, shattering it into a cloud of glittering debris. In the lunar crypt, the room was silent, save for the hum of the computers. Everyone was watching the main screen, where the perfectly ordered icons of the Concordance fleet were now flashing red against each other. An internecine war had just broken out in the middle of their own invasion. My God. Thorn. Rostova's voice, full of awe, crackled over the comms. You did it. But Eris felt no triumph. He was watching a civilization commit suicide. He had given them the tools of individuality, pride, ambition, fear, suspicion, and they had immediately used them to build a gallows for themselves. The human fleet, its purpose served, began a fighting withdrawal, pulling back toward Earth under the cover of the escalating chaos. Their losses were heavy, but they had survived. They had held the line. They had been the rock, and the wave had broken against them, shattering into 1,000 warring currents. But the war was far from over. The Concordance fleet was in disarray, but it was still overwhelmingly powerful, and it was still in their solar system. And somewhere in that fleet was the cold, logical mind of Inquisitor Kalen. She had not been a target of Babel II. She was immune to the petty squabbles of ego and glory, and Eris knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she was watching this chaos, analyzing it, and formulating a response. He had turned the soldiers against each other, but the Inquisitor was still playing a different game, and her move was coming next. While the vanguard of the Concordance fleet descended into a fratricidal brawl in the shadow of Mars, Inquisitor Kalen remained in the cold, silent heart of her command vessel, the Certitude, positioned deep within the fleet's reserve. She did not observe the battle through tactical displays of ships and energy signatures. She observed it as a pure flow of data, a symphony of escalating madness. She saw the ghost commendations, the false logistics reports, the surges of irrational emotional data pride, paranoia, rage that had flooded the command channels. She saw Eris Thorne's hand in every line of corrupted code. He was not fighting a war of territory. He was fighting a war of the mind. He had turned the Concordance's own consciousness against itself. The chaos at the front was not a sign of the primitive's strength, but of her own species' newfound weakness. While the other commanders had been seduced by the poison of ego, Kaylin had been inoculated by her purpose. Her mind processed the human concepts of individuality and ambition not as intoxicating new emotions to be experienced, but as alien variables to be analyzed and solved. She had traced the Babel 2 signals to their source, the same lunar crypt that had birthed the first plague. The humans were not just a pathogen, they were a sentient, adaptive one. Sterilization was still the logical solution, but a brute force assault was now clearly impossible. The fleet was a compromised weapon. She needed a scalpel. Her mind worked with chilling speed. She severed her own ship and her small, elite retinue of vessels from the main Concordance network, creating a hermetically sealed, logically pure command bubble. She was quarantining herself from the insanity. Then, she opened a direct, narrow-band channel, bypassing the chaos of the main fleet. The target was not Eva Rostova's flagship. The target was the lunar crypt. In the sterile white room beneath the Sea of Tranquility, an alert chimed. A sound no one had ever heard before. It wasn't a military alert. It was a hailing frequency, a polite request for communication. On the main screen, the face of Inquisitor Kaylin appeared. Her crystalline features were impassive, but her presence radiated an intelligence so vast and cold it felt like the void of space itself. "Dr. Eris Thorne." The voice was not spoken, but synthesized directly into their systems, a perfect, unaccented stream of English. "Your mimetic weapons are elegant. You have successfully introduced a fatal flaw into our cognitive operating system. In doing so, you have proven your species' intelligence. You have also proven that you are the single greatest threat the galaxy has ever known." Eris stood before the screen, feeling like a microbe under a microscope. General Rostova, patched in from the bridge of the retreating Indomitable, appeared on a side screen, her face grim. "What does it want?" "Thorne," she growled, "to negotiate our surrender. I do not negotiate with contagions." Kaylin's voice filled the room again, as if she had heard the question. "I am here to inform you of the consequences. The concept you call individuality is a destructive parasite. It has crippled my people. But I have formulated the only logical cure, a cure I have synthesized from your own primitive biology." She paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "You humans are defined by your connections to one another. Love, loyalty, empathy. These are not logical constructs, but they are powerful motivators. They are your greatest strength, and, therefore, your greatest vulnerability." On the screen, Kaylin's image was replaced by a live feed. It was a high-resolution view of Earth. Eris could see the curve of continents, the swirl of clouds. It was beautiful and terrifyingly fragile. Then, a single Concordance vessel, one of Kaylin's elite ships, detached from the reserve fleet and began a slow, deliberate descent toward the planet. That vessel's destination is a densely populated urban center you call Geneva, Kaylin stated, her tone utterly devoid of emotion. Its armament is not a wide dispersal energy weapon. It is a kinetic impactor, a simple, dense metallic rod. Its destructive power is precise, absolute, and localized. It will erase that city and everyone in it from your world. You're bluffing, Rostova snarled. You're trying to terrorize us into submission. Terror is an emotional response. This is a mathematical calculation, Kalen replied. I am going to destroy that city. Then, I will choose another. And another. I will continue to do so. One by one. Until Dr. Thorne reverses the effects of his Babel memetics. He will purge the concepts of ego, ambition, and subjectivity from every concordance mind he infected. He will restore us to the logical purity we once possessed. Eris felt the blood drain from his face. It was a hostage situation on a planetary scale. Kalen had seen his weapon and created its perfect antithesis. He had used ideas to attack their collective mind. She was using physical force to attack the source of his ideas, his humanity, his empathy for the millions of lives she was holding at gunpoint. You cannot restore them, Eris said, his voice trembling slightly. You can't make someone unlearn an idea. The walls of your reality are already down. You are incorrect, Kalen stated. Data can be deleted. You will develop a counter-meme, a Babel Zero. It will redefine individuality as a form of psychosis, a destructive error in logic. You will make them fear their own thoughts. You will force them back into the safety of the collective. You have 2 of your hours to begin the process. If you refuse, or if you fail, Geneva will cease to exist. The feed switched back to the descending ship, a silver needle aimed at the heart of Earth. The choice was monstrous. He could save millions of human lives by condemning trillions of alien minds to a state of perpetual, self-policed ignorance, their intellectual horizons forever shackled. Or he could stand by his philosophical victory, the liberation of an entire civilization's consciousness at the cost of watching his own world burn, piece by piece. Rostova's voice was a harsh rasp in his ear. Thorne, this is not a choice. We save our people, whatever the cost. But Eris saw a third option, a path born of the very chaos he had created. Kalen, he said, stepping closer to the screen, you are making a mistake, a logical error. My logic is flawless, the Inquisitor replied. You are threatening to destroy a city to force my compliance, Eris said, his mind racing, weaving a new narrative. That is not a sanitary measure. That is an act of leverage. It is a negotiation, and negotiation is not a function of pure logic. It is a function of desire. You want me to cure your people. That want is a personal, subjective state. You, Inquisitor, have just demonstrated the one thing you claim to be immune to an ego. For the first time, there was a pause. A millisecond of hesitation in the data stream from the certitude. Eris pressed his advantage, his voice growing stronger. Look at your fleet. They are fighting each other for glory, for a concept you despise. But you are no different. You have detached yourself. Position yourself as the sole savior of your species. You crave the glory of being the one who solves the human problem, the need to be right, the need to win. These are the very things you're trying to erase. The plague is already inside you. Inquisitor. You just call it purpose. On the bridge of the certitude, Kalen processed his words. She analyzed them for flaws, for tricks, for mimetic traps. But the core assertion was irrefutable. Her drive to restore order was not a purely logical directive. It was colored by a sense of profound, personal responsibility, a sense of intellectual superiority, a desire to defeat the chaotic human mind that had challenged her. His words were a mirror, and in it, she saw the faint, terrifying outline of an eye. "You have infected them with ambition," Eris said, his final gambit. "And you have infected yourself with pride. What will happen when your fleet sees you, their inquisitor, acting not for the collective good, but for your own personal victory? I can't purge the individuality from your species, Kalen, but I can show them yours. I will broadcast this conversation, your threat, your ultimatum, to every ship in your fleet. I will show them their savior is just as fallen as they are. And then your civil war will not just be about glory. It will be about who gets to define your future. It will be a war of ideas, a true human war." He was bluffing. Broadcasting anything into that chaotic network was nearly impossible. But Kalen didn't know that. She only knew that her perfect logical solution had just been contaminated by the messy, unpredictable stain of her own emerging selfhood. To proceed would be to prove him right. To retreat would be a logical admission of failure. She was trapped in the very first paradox of her own making. The descending ship over Earth slowed. It held its position, a suspended judgment. The silence stretched, a conversation of pure thought taking place across millions of miles. Then, with a quiet that was more profound than any explosion, Kalen's voice returned. "A new variable has been introduced," she stated. "The current strategic model is insufficient. A reevaluation is required." The ship over Geneva began to ascend, slowly, deliberately, pulling away from the fragile blue marble of Earth. Across the Sol system, the chaotic infighting between the concordant ships began to subside, replaced by a confused, tense silence. They had not been defeated. They had not won. They had simply stopped. Peace did not come to the galaxy. What came was something far more complex and uncertain. A cold war of ideas. The concordants did not retreat, but their fleet fractured into ideological blocks. Some, led by commanders like Grasping Claw, advocated for embracing individuality, for forging a new, dynamic future. Others, swayed by Kalen's faction, sought to purge the human madness and restore their old certainty. The galaxy had been plunged into a state of permanent, simmering debate, a state of politics, of philosophy, of art, of doubt. They had, in essence, become more like humanity. Earth was no longer an outsider to be ignored. It was the source of the new galactic consciousness, a place both feared and revered, a mecca of dangerous ideas. Eris Thorn, no longer a weapon, but an ambassador, found himself in the strange position of teaching the elder species about the concepts of democracy, of compromise, of art, of mercy. The warship humanity had sent was not a vessel of steel and plasma. It was an idea, and it had conquered the galaxy not by destroying its enemies, but by forcing them to look in the mirror and see, for the very first time, themselves.